professor and is going to speak to us about what class professors. He is the president of AUST, that's the African University of Science and Technology in Abuja. He did his bachelor's program in mechanical engineering in King's College, London, and went on to Cambridge University to do his PhD, which he did on material science. Our guest speaker worked as a research scientist at McDonnell Douglas Research Labs in St. Louis, Missouri, and then joined the faculty of the Department of Material Science and Engineering at the Ohio State University. He spent a year as a visiting associate professor at MIT before he was appointed professor in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering at Princeton University. Our guest speaker has authored 3 textbooks and 300 peer-reviewed journal papers. He is a recipient of many awards and is here before us today, the president of the African University of Science and Technology. Let us listen to his lecture, Professor Wole Soboyejo, world-class professor.
Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I have to say I'm very honored by the title of this talk. Because when I was invited by Professor Oluwafemi to talk about this, I had to pause a little and ask myself, what is it really to be called a world-class professor? And then he explained to me that what he really wants to do is to develop FUNAAB into a world-class institution. And so what I'm going to try to do is a little different. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to look at the opportunities that I've had to learn from people that I consider to be world-class professors. And I'll try to understand, through my experiences, what it is that I think made those people truly world-class. I will also use my experience in England, in the United States, as a source of some inspiration as to what I think really helps a university to be truly world-class. But even before doing that, I'll try to identify some people in our own Nigerian and African context that are truly world-class, and look at what they did to enable them to achieve this, even with the challenges of our own environment. But before I start, I want to do 2 things. First, I want to thank Professor Oyewole for this initiative and the leadership that he has shown. It has been truly delightful for me as a university president to sit down and watch the team building exercise and the kinds of interactions that are going on. I think these are the kinds of interactions that we really need to move our university system forward. I want to thank Dr. Akindele for working with me and my difficult schedule. But before I go on, I want to thank a few people that might surprise you. So the first people I want to thank really are my parents, who from a very young age raised me up in a university environment and exposed me to the business of ideas. My father, who was a professor at the University of Lagos and is still a professor at the Ohio State University, inspired me tremendously. And my mother, who was a biologist, gave me a strong backbone. And without them, I guarantee you I wouldn't be here today. The other people I want to thank are my mentors, the people who really helped me. And it was interesting when I listened to the discussion about mentors. For me, I know that I benefited from trying to rub off the skin of great scientists. Because the experience that they had enabled me to shape my whole approach to science. And I can guarantee you, without those mentors, I couldn't have done that. And then I want to thank my students and colleagues who have kept me alive. Because you know, it is through your students that you reinvent yourself. And as we get older, we can do less and less because we are not as strong. But when we surround ourselves with young people, with vibrant people, and colleagues to do everything. And so I'm going to present to you some interesting paradigms. And before I do so, though, I also want to congratulate FUNAAB on 25 years. And I've watched the story of FUNAAB very carefully, through various eyes. I'm an Egban man, and my father, who lived in Abuja for many years, was involved at the very beginning in FUNAAB. But even before then, there was a history that you might not know, because when the original decision was made to establish the first university in Nigeria, the Reverend Kuti went to the Alake of Ghana. He had been told by the IFSERAR Commission and the folks involved that they wanted to start a university in West Africa, and they had chosen Nigeria. He went to the Alake, and they had actually given Abeokuta a chance to become the first Nigerian university, but the Alake wanted to be paid for the land. So Reverend Kuti went across the road to Ibadan. And he went to the Olubadan, and he said to the Olubadan, so we want to start this university, and we need land. And the Olubadan said, take a stone and throw it. And when it lands, pick it up again, and throw it again, until you pick up the land that you need. And this is how Ibadan became the University of Ibadan. So when FUNAAB started, a few years later, a few decades later, you can see that Abuja had lost out. But I was happy that FUNAAB started with a new vision, with a niche vision of harnessing the potential of agriculture, using the complete sources of knowledge to drive a new kind of university. And I think what we celebrate today is really the success of that. The outline for the talk, I will give a little bit of background. I'm going to focus on some Nigerian case studies. And those Nigerian case studies, I think, will show us in many ways the recipes for success. I'll also then talk about some global case studies taken from my experiences across the world. And before I finish, I'll talk about two new initiatives. One is this African University of Science and Technology, which I've been working on actually for the last 10 years. And then another one is called the AUST Initiative, which is an initiative that we've been working on for the last 5 years. And at the end of this, we'll try to identify some of the lessons learned and conclude. So, as I said before, I feel very humbled about being here, because quite frankly, it is difficult to really say that this is what you need to be a great professor. And in fact, I think there isn't one type of great professors. There are many types of great professors, although they all share certain things in common. And as I've looked at these great professors, I've tried to kind of look at them and try to understand what is it that really makes a great professor. And sometimes it's surrounded with an institution, but most of the time it's surrounded with the culture of scholarship, the culture of research, and how you live your life. And if you set up this culture, what you do in most cases is you have to set up a pipeline through which you mentor and develop people over time, hopefully to become good. So in my case, I grew up on the campuses of the University of Lagos in the 60s, and it was a time when we had many wonderful, wonderful scholars on that campus. I remember people like Ayodele Awojobi, who was a pioneering professor of mechanical engineering. And many of you might not know this, but not only was he a great professor in the classroom, but if you went to his house, he hand-built swimming pools and all sorts of mechanically sophisticated play toys for people like me. And as I went around that campus, they have people like Professor Adu, who was the father of Shade Adu, who again, another great Nigerian scholar, and so many wonderful people. And they were the people that inspired me. In fact, as a child at the time, I used to wonder if I would get the grades to go to the University of Lagos as a student. And so all great universities inspire you. And it is only when people are inspired that they do work that is greater than what they ever imagined that they could do. So something in the environment has to inspire you. And then later on, I went as an undergraduate student to King's College London. I went there because of one professor. So believe me, I went to all sorts of places for interviews, but this one professor changed my life. And I could see when I talked to him that he took an interest in me. And it was this interest in me that in many ways got me to do everything that I've done. Because that single one professor is the same reason I went to Cambridge University. Because when I actually went to work with him, he said, Wole, you don't want to work with me. You want to go and work with the best person in the world in this field. So great professors are selfless individuals. They are dedicated to students and the development of students. And in many senses, what they look for is how to build young people to achieve their potential. And then later on, I went to work at Ohio State University. The Ohio State University, in many senses, was set up at the same time with a vision of what FUNAAB has to be. You know, it was a university that was developed to transform the agricultural potential of the state of Ohio into an industrialized society. At the time, in the 1800s, Ohio was an agrarian economy, not much industry. And that single university did two things. One is it educated farmers that went to farm in the state of Ohio and created a wealth through extension farming and community-based agriculture that resulted in the initial growth of the state of Ohio. It then educated engineers who were able to mechanize industry and add value to agricultural products that enabled the state to go from an agrarian economy to a technologically developed economy in a few decades. And so within that kind of a state university, you meet different kinds of students. In my case, I met students who came from farms in Ohio, and within 4 years, we transformed them into world-leading engineers through a process of education that transformed the state. And then later on, I had a chance to teach at MIT and Princeton. They're different universities. MIT is a techie university. It's full of students that just love technology, and they are totally immersed in technology and innovation, but they're not necessarily leaders. If you give them anything, they will consume it. If you give them any kind of technology, innovation, opportunity space, they will innovate and create, but they're not necessarily the leaders. Whereas Princeton is a university that produces leaders. Now, each one of those is different. In the case of a university that produces leaders, if I were to talk to them as I'm talking to you, most of them will sit down and they will be saying, what is he going to tell me? I'm going to make money in Wall Street. But if he tells me something that's interesting, I will dedicate my life to it. And then I will become the leader in that field. And so how you orient your university's mission matters. And the kind of people you produce, you attract, really matter. And similarly, what we're now trying to do at the African University of Science and Technology in Abuja is to create a new generation of leaders. But we want them to be technological leaders or industrial leaders. And how we have developed the curriculum and how we have developed the strategy also matters. And I'll try to give some insights around just what went in, what kind of thinking went into developing these kinds of concepts. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge a few people. Some may be known to you, but some may not be known to you. But these are, in some senses, some of the people that I consider to be world-class professors that have existed within our own space here in Nigeria. But many of you may not know their stories. I'm going to start with the story of Adeoye Lambu. So Adeoye Lambu is a very special man. He was educated in medicine. And in many senses, when he came back to Nigeria, he came back to an environment, did not have research labs, did not have research equipment, and even did not have enough hospitals to practice medicine. So for most of us, it would be like saying, I'm a scientist, I have no research funding, I have no research lab, I have nothing. And most of us would give up under those circumstances. But what did he do? He thought out of the box. So the first thing he did was he started doing community-based medicine. he didn't have a hospital, but he would ride his bike from one village to the other, delivering medical care to people in the Abuja area. And then he said, well, I want to do research. I have no labs, I have no money, I have no infrastructure, but I want to do world-class research. So what he did was he started thinking, what can I do, what's important, and where do we have some uniqueness? And he started studying the approaches of our own indigenous people to treatment of mental illness. But he did it with rigorous scientific approaches. And all the way from Abuja here, he started publishing in Nature. Without money, without research funding, without all the fancy equipment. But because his scientific method was first-rate, he was able to publish first-rate papers all the way from this environment. And from here, he went on to become Vice-Chancellor of the University of Ibadan. And then the number 2 man at the WHO. So what matters is imagination and the scientific approach, as opposed to just having money without that. You can have all the money you want, but if you don't have that sound training, imagination, and the scientific approach, it doesn't matter. Then another one, which you might be surprised about, many of you have probably never heard of, his name is John Amazigo. He's a professor at Nsukka. John Amazigo was educated at Harvard by a guy called Bernie Kudiansky. And in my early days, they tried to hire me at Harvard. It was quite an interesting experience. And as I went there, as a very green, young scientist, everybody knew about John Amazigo. Because John Amazigo had been not only educated by them, but he had done world-leading work where he had used basically very, very, very sound mathematics to develop new concepts for the design of novel materials. He developed something called synergistic concepts for modeling, transformation, toughening materials. He looked at all sorts of complex analysis that really took his mathematics to world-class levels. And so everywhere I went, people ask me, where's John Amazigo? Where's John? I say, it's at UNN. They say, where's that? And so, what I'm trying to say is, even within our own environment, we have produced many people in science that have made world-leading contributions in ways that we should be proud of. And then in the humanities, it's interesting to look at the success. Although many of us as scientists, we often think of science and engineering, but actually many of our greatest successes have been in the humanities and social science. And so if I look at, say, Wole Soyinka, in my opinion, he's the deepest writer in the English language in Africa. That's why he won the Nobel Prize. Chinua Achebe, Cyprian Ekwesi, they write beautiful stories. But in the case of Wole Soyinka, if you've read The Man Died, if you've read The Interpreters, if you've read a lot of his books, you realize that this is a man that has many, many levels of depth in ways that will make him a world-leading writer no matter the society he lives in. But what really special was that he didn't try to be European. He looked inside into our own society for his sources of inspiration, and he innovated in ways that made him special. And then another one I'm going to talk about is Professor Oluwafemi. He's a historian. Again, a world-leading scholar, dedicated to his art. And a man, as I'll show you later, that could have been anything. He was at one point Vice-Chancellor of the University of Lagos, but he will be forever remembered as the leading African historian of his time. So I want to just talk a little bit about these folks and look at what is it really that enabled them to achieve the kind of world-class status that they have. If you look at Adeoye Lambo, he thought out of the box. He wasn't defeated by the challenges that he faced on the ground. And then he also used rigorous scientific methods combined with our own indigenous approaches to do something that was unique. He published in world-class journals from Nigeria, and he had a bold vision that allowed him to go from where we are to anywhere in the world that will accept people on merit. If you look at Amazigo, it was his rigorous training in mathematics and then the application to interesting problems. Then he built on that, of course, a solid reputation as a scholar, and he would visit Harvard periodically to do important work, but always come back to Africa. And he worked with world-leading people in his field. Buliansky, Hutchinson, and others are people that I knew personally. And in the case of these four, the first time I would visit them in Harvard, I think it was around 1989, I was a clean PhD. And I remember going there, wondering if I had anything to say, because these are the people that wrote the books that I've read, that I've written the papers, that have guided me. But what I found was that this was a community of scholars that lived very Spartan lives. They had very bare bone wooden tables with a few bookshelves. And their offices were no more than that space there. From those offices, they had changed the world. And so when I listen to people asking for a lot of things, I think about them and I say, it isn't just money, it is really the culture of research and learning. And then in the case of Wole Soyinka, it's quite interesting to follow his life. You know, he got a third-class degree in English from the University of Ibadan for the same reasons that made him great. You see, because he was experimenting with the English language. And if you're a traditional English writer, you wouldn't like Benkelmes. But if you are a creative English writer, you recognize that this is how the English language is going to evolve when it comes into contact with African people. And he pushed ideas in ways that didn't agree with the convention of the time. And so if you look at some of the people who got the first class, from Morocco, Leslie, and some of those things, they were very solid, but they were not as creative. And later, when he went to the University of Leeds, the same Wole Soyinka a few years ago, got a first-class degree. And then he came back to teach at Ibadan. They didn't want to promote him because he didn't have a PhD. But yet, he was the best writer in the English language in our own environment, where we had such greats as Chinua Achebe, who, when he wrote his book, that book was defined as the best book in the English language since World War II. So we had this kind of depth of scholarship, of creativity, of artistic expression, all developed within our own environment. But I think what made Wole Soyinka a little different was the depth of his analysis, the depth of his writing, in a way that made him really a sophisticated writer. So this is why he was awarded the Nobel Prize for English Literature for work done here in Nigeria. Which basically shows that when your work is inspired by the true sources of scholarship, and you project it at a global level, then it really has world-class status. And it was interesting, I remember as a graduate student inviting him to Cambridge University. And he said, well, who is inviting me? So I said, well, you know, the African students are inviting me. He said, I won't come if it is only the African students. But if the English department also invites me, then I will come. So I remember running up to the English department. And of course, they were happy to invite me. And we, as the African students, benefited from this visit. So he was a serious scholar. He is a serious scholar. He wasn't just somebody that was pushed around to come, but he was somebody who looked at his art, who looked at his role, and as a result, achieved world-class status from here in our society. And then Jai, many of you may not know the story. He got 9 A's, he went to Book College. He could have done anything. But he chose to do history because that was his love. And he studied African history to the depth that anybody could study African history. And if you don't understand the need to study African history, you know, you need to look at what some of the people in the West have written about African history. There's a former master of King's College in Cambridge who wrote that African history is the history of darkness. And that is not the subject of history. Professor at Cambridge. Whereas when you read the works of people like Abuja, you realize why we have to study African history at the highest level. And you realize, of course, the encyclopedic knowledge that this kind of people have. And one of the things that I encountered as a young professor in the United States was listening to a lecture by Abuja. It was like a scientific lecture. It was full of well-reasoned arguments and facts, and it was totally beautiful. The only lecture that I ever listened to that was even comparable was by Wole Soyinka. Again, it was like a scientific lecture. As you listen to him, you say, wow, this is a different level of analysis that I've ever had. It's really additional insights that I've never seen. And it really allows you to really realize the value of 6, 7 decades of a lifetime of scholarship. And so people like this chose to stay in Nigeria. And from within Nigeria, they have made internationally recognized contributions because they're true scholars. So when we look at those folks, we realize that even from our great Nigerians, there are a few lessons to learn. So one is if you leave a life which you're dedicated to scholarship with some service, you can achieve world-class status. And then the other thing that's important is that imagination and dedication are more important than knowledge. You know, a lot of people say, I got this fact, I got that fact, or whatever. But often I look at my brain, I don't remember too many things. But it is how can you put these things together creatively that distinguishes you from all sorts of people that have access to that information. It's how practical you are at doing your research. You don't have to choose that piece of work that you can't do when there are other things that you can do and make an input. It's also how you pick your topics. Don't pick a field where you're going to follow other people. Pick a field where you're going to make original contributions and then use global best practices to make sure that the work is done at the highest levels. And then make your subject come alive. Whatever it is that you do, make it come alive in a way that inspires others to want to do this. And then ultimately, as you do your work, it will be recognized. It's quite interesting, you know, as I pick the different topics that I've worked on, I have never cared what other people think. I only care what I think. And then you go to some meeting and say, oh, I read your book, I did this. I said, I didn't know, I forgot about it. So don't worry about what other people think. If you're really doing the best work you can, in the end, the recognition will come. So let's look a little bit at some of the global best practices. I'm going to give you 2 sets of examples. And I'm trying to draw from some of the experiences that I've had. So I'm going to take the first set of examples from my experience as a student at Cambridge. And then I'm going to take a second set of examples from the United States. Now, when you first go to Cambridge, it's really humbling. Because you have these old buildings and these very simple people. And after a while, at least in my case, I used to wonder what I was doing there. Because I felt very humbled by everything I saw around me. All these great professors quietly riding their bicycles. And all these great students. And for the first few weeks, I was quite confused. And I think all great universities have that aura. You sort of wonder, gee, am I good enough to be here, whatever, you know. And then eventually I get to meet most of my lecturers or professors. Then they say, don't call me professor, just call me John. Then they say, you know, don't just relax, have a cup of tea, let's talk about it. Oh, you can't do it, I can't do it too. So after a while, you begin to convince yourself that maybe you're one of them. Maybe you're one of them. Having tea with the guys, and then you two can't do it, he can't do it. You must be alright. But in the middle of all of that, I met some wonderful, wonderful people, and I want to tell you about some of them. So one of these guys is a guy called Stephen Hawking. He was a great astrophysicist, a guy who wrote the book. So what I like about him was that I would look at this person, you know, with all his problems, he's a paraplegic. But, you know, he had a normal life. And he inspired me tremendously. And I'll tell you later on why. And then there was another one who was the scientific advisor to the originally. And he was actually the advisor of my PhD advisor. And one thing that I would always remember is each day I would go to the library and I would be checking what's in the journals, making notes. In those days we didn't have all these fancy tools. So I'd make notes on my little pad. And here was this 70-something-year-old man every day who would always come in and he would also make his notes. I think one day you're making notes with Alan Guthrie. That's funny. And he would ask me, how are you? And I was like, oh, I'm fine, Professor. Then my PhD advisor was a guy I just called John. His name was John North. And we joked about many things, and he would explain things to me. And as far as I knew, he was John. And then there was another guy called Mike Ashby, who I would see riding on his bicycle. He's actually the son of Lord Ashby. Actually the greatest material scientist that ever lived. But they were all normal people, accessible by students, and that would have time for even young students like me to go and talk to them and have a cup of tea. So let me just go through each one of these and look at what they were and how they affected me as an individual. So in the case of Stephen Hawking, he was the location professor of mathematical students. I said, if this man can do what he's doing, I have no excuse for not being able to do my little experiment with my little model. So I received tremendous inspiration just from watching how, from that great difficulty, he pursued his life. And as I watched that, what I learned is that we should never let anything stop us. What is really important is the power of the human mind and its ability to project whatever it is that we want to do. And this, in my mind, is what makes Stephen Hawking a truly great example. The other one, Alan Cottrell, was a Goldsmith Professor of Metallurgy at Cambridge. At the time, I have to tell you, when he was a professor, they only had one professor. And under him, he trained Mike Ashby. This person, I tell you, is the greatest materials person. He trained my advisor. He trained many great people. And I think the reason he did that was because of the nature of his personality. He was somebody that appeared simple, but very engaging, and made young people feel welcome. He went on to become the scientific advisor to the government of the United Kingdom. And what I always found was that at his advanced age, he was always learning, and he's still alive. And one thing I can promise you is that he will be in that library every day, learning. So at the end of my time there, he gave a lecture, in fact, a series of 4 lectures, called 4 Lectures on the Theory of Metals, where he started from Schrödinger's wave equation and built up the basic idea of what the metal is. And at the end of the first lecture, I concluded that I knew nothing about metals. At least I concluded that I had a lot to learn about metals. And by the end of the 4th lecture, everybody in the room concluded that they also had a lot to learn. But most of us concluded we knew nothing about metals. And this comes after a lifetime of learning. You don't get it overnight. And it is only when you have that kind of dedication that you can become truly world-class. The other one is Mike Ashby. He's an interesting one. He's the son of Lord Ashby, the Ashby Commission person who created the educational policy for West Africa and Nigeria. He was a student of Cottrell, and he got his PhD, and then went to Harvard University, which it turns out was not a very good university for him. Because at that time, Harvard hadn't given tenure to any professor in applied science for about 30 years. And he did not get tenure at Harvard. But he was truly brilliant. The reason he didn't get tenure at Harvard is that he proposed some new ideas that nobody else understood. And the folks at Cambridge recognized his brilliance, asked him to come as a co-professor, ignoring the guys at Harvard that had turned him down. And he then proceeded to do world-leading work in many different areas, where he took complicated things and made them simple. And those ideas, by the way, that were not accepted in 1970 are now in every textbook today. Which means that the universities that evaluate professors must be very careful. Often when the established people who cannot see beyond this say that it's not good, be very careful. Because often the most brilliant people take a while. And today, by the way, all those same people that didn't understand it 40 years ago now recognize him as a truly great scientist. Now, I had contact with him about 10 years ago, And one of the things I found is we would sit down and he would always just take a complex idea and make it beautiful and simple. And as I started my work in this area, what I found was that by sitting around people like that, I was able to focus that work, informed by their wisdom, more than what you can ever achieve by just reading their papers. And then there's a case of my PhD advisor, a very brilliant mind, dedicated his whole life to students. And he rose through the ranks, but as far as I was concerned, he was John, my PhD advisor. And one day I remember going to a conference, and then I realized that he was the top person in the field. Everybody, John, you don't bow. And all these Japanese people who keep bowing even after they left the room. and then all these other people, you know. So, leading experts in the world in this field. But what I learned, though, was that this kind of personality is often as simple and accessible. And so for me, I had learned everything he had to teach me just through informal conversations. Whereas if you keep a distance between you and the student, that learning experience goes away. And so you see, in some senses, the way you can judge all these great people is they breed great students. In the case of John Nunn, he educated about 60 PhDs. Many are professors at leading universities across the world. And they characterize them, some call themselves children of John Nunn, some call themselves grandchildren, and we now have great-grandchildren. But you see what I mean? They breed communities of scholars, and that is what it really truly means. So what are the lessons? So great professors, in my opinion, dedicate their lives to scholarship, continuous learning, teaching, and research. So they evolve in their lifetimes and they continuously learn new things. And this continues even after they achieve high administrative positions. So some of them can become leaders of departments, vice-chancellors of universities, ministers or advisors to governments. But they continue to learn. They make sure that even after those administrative positions, they are still academics. Right? And then their simplicity and their focus is the key. So whenever I see an academic and very sophisticated, I don't trust them. Because I know who we are. And I know who we are. If you look at us, it just means we're trying to act proud, right? And so the simplicity, the careful focus to long-term scholarship, and then the desire to achieve deep knowledge in an area, as opposed to just a superficial treatment or something, supported by some kind of a university culture, in my opinion, is what really makes a great professor. And then when you have the combination of great professors in contact with students within a certain culture, it doesn't take much before those great students become great professors and great innovators. So often when people go and they say, oh, it's only money, I don't believe that. I think what you need first is a great culture. A great culture of young people, simple, dedicated scholars, working together in an environment where they can really help young people come up. And when you see this, you know you have a truly great environment. And by the way, the mentors have to be people that young people want to emulate. You can't buy it. Yes. You know, when I see someone I want to emulate, I see it because of qualities that person might not even realize that they have. And then I say, wow, I hope I can be at least half as good as this. And for me, when I look at great people, many of them, I never even told them I thought they were great. Just as I was inspired by Ayodele Awojobi as a young boy, I was inspired by Cottrell and North and Ashby. I've been inspired by great people wherever I see them. And I try to learn from those qualities. It is only when the qualities of the senior people inspire the young ones that they truly become great mentors. Okay, now in the United Kingdom, at least when I was a student, they were fairly classical. And then I call those the classical professors. They're dedicated to scholarship, and they lead very simple lives. In the United States, it's a little bit more complex. And so what I want to do is I want to share with you the experiences that I've had at different kinds of universities that I've had a chance to interact with. So my first real teaching job was at the Ohio State University. And this is a state university. It's one of the Big Ten. So they have a culture that mixes academics and big sport. But in engineering, it's very serious. And the materials folks, for example, there are very, very strong, especially in metals. So when I went there, in some senses I was very lucky because I was able to meet some really top-notch scholars and a different kind of students. The students there are average students from Ohio farms. They're not all totally brilliant, but some of them are. But what made me proud in that university was that you could take average students from farms around Ohio, and within 4 years, you really turn them into gems. And most of it is because they're hardworking, they're determined, they want to slug it out to really learn. And then within those universities, you find in some cases real giants of scholars. So one of these is a guy called John Hirth. John Hirth was a professor there in the Ohio State University for about 40 years. And from very humble beginnings, he was also a student at that same university. He became one of the leaders of the field, and I'll tell you what made him special later. Another one is Paul Paris, who was a professor at Washington University that I met when I was in industry, who again became one of the leaders, again from very humble beginnings. And then at MIT Harvard, I met different kinds of scholars. The interesting thing about these scholars is that in many cases they were great classical scholars, but they didn't always get it right. And I'll show you how you as an individual have to be careful when you come into contact with some of these great scholars and great personalities to make sure you don't lose yourself. And then at Princeton, I've also met a number of great scholars. One of them is a guy called Professor Lau, who was one of the first Chinese professors at an Ivy League university. And believe it or not, that man single-handedly has had more profound impact on the education of Chinese people in science and engineering than you can imagine. And I'll show you exactly how he did it. And then the last one is a guy who's a billionaire, Professor Stephen Forrest, who was one of the founders of organic electronics. And these are all people that I've had a chance to interact with in my time as a researcher in the US. So let's start with John Hirth. So John Hirth was educated at the Ohio State University in the 1950s. He's a gentle giant. If you meet him, he's about 6'6" or so. He's always meek and gentle. The most brilliant man in metallurgy. And when he graduated in 1957, he wrote a book after spending 1 year as a postdoc at the University of Bristol called The Theory of Dislocations. The book looks like a Bible. So people often call it the Bible of Dislocations. Please forgive the Reverend Mother. But you know, when you meet this man, as simple as they come, but the most incisive man, but yet he will always try to make himself accessible. As brilliant as he will, when he tries to describe it to you, he will keep it simple. But yet, by the end of the conversation, you realize that you're really talking to somebody that really sheds light with each word that comes across. Then at the time, he was the editor of one of the leading journals. And he knew that I was a young professor hungry to publish. At each time I would submit a paper, I would get the response to the paper within 1 or 2 days. Fully reviewed. And he didn't just do it for me, he did it for everybody. So you can imagine what dedication it took for him to do this. And so for me, when I look at him, I think of him as really a great example of how you must handle yourself. Even as you get busier and busier, you have to deal with more things. And when I look at his achievements over time, it's really as a scholar, a dedicated scholar. Now, the other one, Paul Paris, is mixed. So Paul Paris is what I'll call an entrepreneurial professor. even as a graduate student, by the way, he went to University of Michigan, and then he went to a place called Lehigh University to do his PhD. But when he was at Lehigh University, they realized that many airplanes were crashing because they developed cracks inside of them. And in fact, the whole British aerospace industry went down because they were not able to work out how to manage the cracks. But the mechanics that he learned was what was needed to design those aircraft safely. And so through his working with Boeing, Boeing went from being the number 3 or number 4 aircraft producer to being the number 1 aircraft producer, with this young man becoming rich in the process. So even before he finished his PhD, he was consulting for Boeing. Now, he then wrote some papers in the field that were not fully accepted by his peers. They said, oh, this cannot be so. It turns out that this was. And in the process of everybody realizing that this was so, within a few years he became globally recognized as the leader in the field. And in fact, that mechanics that he developed then enabled all sorts of aircraft companies to succeed where others had failed. And then he started a consulting company called Dell Research Company. And through this Dell Research Company, he became wealthy. So, in this case, you can see that he can combine academic success and business success. And there's nothing wrong with it if you don't lose focus on your academics. And I see him as somebody that really is a great illustration of an attractive academic personality. I first met him when I was working in industry in St. Louis, and he became like a friend and a father figure to me. And in many senses, he gave me tremendous inspiration, because he believed so much in me. And every letter of promotion that I ever got always had him saying, this fellow is great, this fellow is great. And he did it not only for me, but for many, many young people that he had profound impact on their lives. One of the most memorable occasions that I always remember was having dinner with him and a few others where we drank $1,000 bottles of wine. And I laughed when this was with Yansky and all these people. It's like having dinner with Isaac Newton and some of these folks drinking $1,000 bottles of wine. I said, if only my folks could see me in America. So you realize that these are attractive personalities. They are people you enjoy being around. And there are people that when young people look at them, they say, look, I want to be an academic. This is a symbol of success. This is something that excites me. This is something that believes in me. And then Frank McClintock, who is almost the exact opposite of Paris. Frank McClintock was a professor at MIT. When I spent my year at MIT, he was the person that I worked closely with. So at the time I was writing my first textbook. And because Frank had written the textbook before, I was so desperate to work closely with him. And I learned from him the value of true scholarship. Frank was somebody who cared about every letter, every word, every dot, every detail. And as such, if you really want to learn about being a scholar, really caring about everything you do, he was a wonderful mentor. Because I saw, my God, this is how people care. He would read everything 5 or 10 times before he would let it out. And then whenever he sent anything out, he knew it was right. And as we made our contributions working together, I really appreciated the value of the kind of scholarship that he brought. I also could see the challenge, and his challenge was this. Whenever he thought of something, he could only see it this way. And so very often he got it wrong, because he couldn't stand back and see the bigger picture. So when some of the younger people came up, like Paris, he rejected all their papers. And he told me, he said, Wole, I didn't agree with that. Because it said something, and it turns out he was wrong. But the beauty of the man was later, he said, I didn't see it at the time. Because he was so focused on just looking at the world his way. Now, to my great surprise, after I interacted with him, I respected him greatly but I realized that I had to choose a different path. Because when I stepped back and I looked at the bigger picture, what I realized is I could be worrying about a comma here and a full stop here. Or I could look at the bigger picture and say, look, you know, Wole, you're an African. You have a bigger mission than just dotting a comma and putting a full stop. You have to think more broadly about the environment in which you're from and do something. So we should be careful with our interactions with some of these great people, because sometimes they can inspire us, but they shouldn't limit us. Okay, now Professor Lam, yes, an interesting character. He was educated at Princeton in the 1940s, and he became a young assistant professor there in the department that I am now in. But you know, the thing that I find special about this man is not only did he make seminal contributions in fluid mechanics, but he mentored Chinese right from the 40s to the current day. And you can imagine how difficult it was in China those days. He paid for the GRE or whatever exam for every single Chinese student. When they came, he mentored them on how to survive in the system. And then every young professor, he mentored them so that they would get tenure. And you can imagine when you do this for 60 or 70 years, making a big contribution. When he retired, he gave a donation of $1 million out of his retirement fund to the department to be used by the head of department for anything he needed to use it for. And he did not ask for a single kobo or any benefits. And even today, he must be in his 90s, he continues to come to the department, do his research, well into his 90s. Now, when I went there, just before he retired, he would sit down quietly in any meeting we would have. And people would talk a lot, often not saying anything. And he would just sit down. But at the end of the conversation, Sumila would say just one or two things, and he would just clear up everything. And so what I realize is this, you know, in some senses, this kind of folks, they think before they speak. And everything they speak, everything they write is rigorously well conceived. And when you listen to them, they are wisdom, not just knowledge. And in some senses, in my mind, he epitomizes the attributes of a truly great scholar that didn't forget where he was from. And then Stephen Forrest. This is, in some senses, he's been my best collaborator ever. But a very interesting character, very, very strong personality, and a pioneer in the field of solar energy, organic electronics. But because his personality is so strong, the university administration didn't like it. Because you just tell them they're full of it. They're wrong. They're not aggressive. So they removed him from being head of the chemical engineering department. But one day he came to my office and said, Wole, you know, I have some problem with trying to make light-emitting devices. So Stephen Forrest, by the way, is one of the pioneers in the development of light-emitting devices and organic source. His ideas basically have led to a company called Universal Display Corporation that's valued at about $3 billion. So what he does is that company funds all of his research. They fund him to the tune of about $2 million. And he's somebody that, although he comes across as being very aggressive, if you work with him, he's truly your friend. So this man approached me, and we started working together on some ideas. And after a while, we said, well, just fill in this form, we're going to file a patent for two, which we did. And eventually, we wrote some papers, we solved the problem. So one day, I got a phone call saying, well, we want to make a deposit into your bank account. I said, why? He said, well, somebody's paying you from Samsung. So the nature of this interaction was such that we were doing not only world-leading research, but he always had his eye on the products in the market. So in that sense, he's somebody who has a knack for doing very good research, but also innovation that hits the market. And as a result of that, what happened was eventually when Princeton wouldn't promote him to be whatever, he went to become vice president for research at the University of Michigan. And he's actually driving the whole solar energy and innovation at that university. So you see, again, more commercial scientist, but somebody that really knows how to make things work. And if you're going to manage that kind of a person in a university, you have to be willing to let them express themselves. So what are the lessons? In the case of the US, I hope you see that what really works there is a lifetime dedicated to what I call entrepreneurial scholarship. It's not just enough to be a scholar, you have to be entrepreneurial. In a way, your research group is like a small business. And when you run it, the university benefits, you benefit, and in many ways, what you do through your life is to sell your ideas to many generations of promising young people. And if I look at my research group over the last 20 or so years, that's essentially what has inspired the approach that we have. In that period, we have graduated 30 PhDs. About half of them are professors at many universities in the US. The rest of them is a professor of rice. They're professors all over. Some are in industries, some have started new businesses. But what I realize is that what you need to do is to suck in young people, encourage them and motivate them, recognize their strengths, and create an environment where many generations of students can come and grow. And the talents that they bring are often different. I mean, the most recent one, I remember, even as a first year as an undergraduate, I realized her potential in terms of innovation. And within a few months, she got a grant, even to fund me. I found it so funny. When he says, "Oh, Prof, I've got some money for you." And then the next thing, she won another award as one of the top 20 innovators under the age of 20, for which they gave her $250 to go and pursue whatever she wanted to do. But what I recognized in her at the beginning was that she was creative. And we created an environment for her where she could thrive. And so in the US, what works is entrepreneurial scholarship. But the type of success is often determined by the nature of the university's policies. And it's important to understand the differences. So for example, let's say you look at a university like Stanford University. You notice they spawned of Silicon Valley. You have many businesses that are successful, driven by the university. But what happens in Stanford is this. If you have a good idea, the university comes to you and says, "How can I help you to develop this? We help you get the patent, we help you make this commercial, but you own the company, and we get some profit." And as a result of that, you find that many of the professors form companies. Now, when you form the companies, you benefit, the university benefits. And in fact, when it's time for promotion, they don't say, "Oh, you formed the company, therefore you cannot be promoted." They say, "No, they say, you formed the company, this is part of your promotion." And as a result of that, the professors are innovative. In fact, one of the professors there in computer science is a guy called Olusola Oyewole. He's a Nigerian. And so, on one of our trips, back and forth from Nigeria, I remember sitting with Olusola. If you see Olusola is probably slightly younger than I am. So I said, "Kule, how do you afford to live in Stanford? Because the place is too expensive. To buy a house, you need $2-3 million. How do you afford it?" So Kule smiled. He said, "You know, I've had 2 sabbaticals. Each sabbatical I've had, I've created a company. And each company that I've created, I've turned around and sold it. And one of these companies, Afari Systems, was bought by Sun Microsystems. And so the money I made from that is what I used to buy my house." So I laughed. "So you're a silent billionaire." And I laughed. But you understand me? In the process of doing this work, he found success, commercial success, but also academic success. So we need university policies that really enable this to happen in our own environment in a way that convinces our people that this is possible. So in some senses, what the US system does is has elements to promote the development of world-class professors. In fact, they design it. They don't leave it to chance. Because what they have is at the beginning they have funding for what they call young investigators.